Hey everybody, Trey here. Welcome back to another forecast discussion. It's that time, the multi-day severe weather event that we've been highlighting for the last couple of videos is upon us here. Today, Monday, April 11th, 2022. Started off last night with some elevated hailstorms up in northern Oklahoma into southwest Missouri that have continued into this morning, and they are going to kind of play an indirect role in what we're going to see today. The SPC has an enhanced risk out centered on basically north central to west central Arkansas into far southeast Oklahoma, surrounded by a slight risk that does include the Dallas-Fort Worth metro and Waco areas, as well as the Little Rock, Memphis, and Jackson, Tennessee areas up into far southern Missouri. So these storms today will have a tornado threat centered within that enhanced risk area, that level 3 out of 5 risk area, as well as a damaging wind and a large hail threat, potentially a significant severe hail threat for hailstones over 2 inches in diameter. So we've got kind of two areas we're watching today. Of course, this enhanced risk area up here, up into mainly Arkansas, and then down here along the dry line into Texas. Does include the Dallas-Fort Worth metro area, the Waco, Texas area as well as places like Paris, Sulphur Springs, Mount Pleasant, as far as Texas goes. So we're going to highlight both of these kind of different areas today, and let's start by taking a look at the satellite picture right now. So you can see what we've got here. We're kind of in between the influence of two different troughs here. You can see this first one kind of out here. It's kind of just broad zonal flow across the region. Zonal meaning that west to east flow. And you can start to see where our second trough is coming from. It's starting to dig down into the Pacific Northwest, and that's going to be our main focus for severe storms tomorrow, Tuesday, and Wednesday. But we're not going to feel the influence from this trough today. We're going to kind of be in between these two troughs as this one moves off to the east, and we kind of get this purely zonal flow across much of the central and southern part of the U.S. And we'll take a look at that in a second. You can also see what we have going on here. We got a complex of storms that has emanated from that overnight activity, stretching from far northwest Arkansas up into Missouri, and then into a separate area kind of into Illinois and Indiana, with some more storms down here in far east Texas, approaching the kind of Beaumont, Houston areas, Lake Charles, into Louisiana there. These storms are not severe at this point, and don't expect them to be severe throughout the morning. Maybe some isolated instances of severe hail and wind, but do not expect these storms to be severe throughout the morning. If we take a look at the radar picture right now, you can see clearly what's going on here. This is our complex in northwest Arkansas here. And I want you to take note of this fine line right here that starts to sag down from this convection. That is an outflow boundary. These winds have rushed out to the surface from these storms. They've become outflow dominant, and they pushed out this outflow boundary here. Let me pause the radar here for you and show you kind of exactly where it is right now. So it's kind of emanating from these storms, so it's going to be somewhere in here at this point. So that's going to be our outflow boundary, and that's our main focus for severe storms today across the enhanced risk area. So we're going to have to watch closely, and this is a pretty simple setup, pretty complex setup, pretty simple to spot the forcing mechanism today. So it's going to be this outflow boundary. We're going to have to watch surface observations extremely closely today to figure out where it's going to reside. With storms ongoing, would not be surprised to see this continue to surge southward as we have kind of that source of the outflow continue. But if these storms die off, that outflow boundary won't have anything to sustain it. So it may stall somewhere out here in southern Arkansas, south central Arkansas into far southeast Oklahoma or northeast Texas, up into the Ohio River Valley there. So we're going to have to watch closely. If we take a look at our surface map here, and let me refresh it to make sure we have the most up-to-date data, you can see kind of what's going on here. So we have this kind of sagging cold front that produced the storms, that is producing the ongoing storms today and produced the storms last night. And then we have our outflow boundary down here. You can see where the winds start to change here. So you can see up here in northeast Arkansas, the winds are almost, or northwest Arkansas, excuse me, the winds are almost due easterly. So they're coming out of the east. And then you can see they start to back down here out of the southeast. So our outflow boundary is kind of located somewhere in here, and we saw that on the radar where it was located. And so this is going to be our focus for storms today, because we're kind of in between the influences of the two troughs. We're going to see almost neutral lifting mechanisms, neutral sort of height tendencies, meaning that the heights may begin to rise a little bit. When we talk about troughs at the upper levels of the atmosphere, when we have troughs like that, that promotes rising motion in the exit region and surface low development in that exit region, so that we have height falls in the exit region of this trough. But when you have slight ridging aloft, that promotes surface high pressure development and sinking motion instead. So when you have slight ridging like this, or almost neutral flow in the upper levels of the atmosphere, that does not promote rising motion in storms in general. So you're going to need some sort of other mechanism to initiate storms in this regime, and in this case, it's going to be the outflow boundary. Again, wherever that outflow boundary sets up, whether it sets up, somewhere in southern Arkansas into northeast Texas, or it retreats north a little bit, kind of sits around that Jonesboro to Little Rock corridor into southeast Oklahoma, is yet to be seen. Given the current position of where it is, let me play this again. Given the current position of where it is, it's somewhere from northeast Arkansas down towards central Arkansas. Here is Little Rock, right where my cursor is there, into far southeast Oklahoma, and still shows signs of continuing to move off to the south throughout the day. So this may well end up in northeast Texas, and if that's the case, that may be a focus for storms up there in far northeast Texas. Now let's go down to our surface map here for Texas here. Let's show you where that moisture is, that best moisture. So you will notice here that the upper 60s dew points kind of confined here to far south Texas along the Texas Gulf Coast, places like Corpus Christi, Houston, Galveston, up toward the 68 to kind of 70 degree dew point range, with low to mid 60s up toward the Red River and into central Arkansas. So we do have some low-level moisture that will continue to advance northward today as we have these surface southerlies here. Perhaps a weak sort of frontal circulation up in here, perhaps a weak surface low up here in northwest Texas. That may provide a little bit of surface convergence today for storms up here, kind of closer to the Dallas-Fort Worth metro area. But it's going to, again, the forcing is quite nebulous today. We're not quite sure where the forcing is going to come besides surface boundaries. So let's take a look at some soundings today and show you the difference between these two environments. So this is going to be the 12Z, or 7 a.m. Central Daylight Time, Fort Worth sounding. And you'll notice right off the bat what we've got going on here. We've got a very, very stout capping inversion in place. Very stout warm nose, extremely steep lapse rates aloft, emanating from the elevated mixed layer, which is that layer of dry, warm air aloft that emanates from the desert southwest and northwest Mexico. And on the mid-level winds gets transported here over our severe weather target area. So that's in place today. And the fact that we don't have any forcing mechanism, at least on the large scale, is going to mean that this cap is going to stay put for much of the day. We're going to have to rely on strong surface heating to get the job done. And you'll notice here our convective temperature, or the temperature that the surface needs to reach in order for convection to happen. It's not a great parameter to use, but it's a decent estimate. 94 degrees Fahrenheit. So that's a little bit warmer than the forecast high temperature for today. We'd expect that the upper 80s are kind of going to be more like it there for parts of central and north Texas. Might get close down there with southern extent. But again, I think just given the lack of forcing across this region, and if we take a look at our Mesoanalysis page here, you can see what we've got going on at 500 millibars, and what I mean by lack of forcing. So you can see here's our trough here up in the Pacific Northwest. We've got a little shortwave out here into the southern part of the country. And we're kind of going to be in the middle of these two. So we're not having any direct kind of forcing from any trough today. And the flow, as a result, is going to kind of be west to east, or zonal. And that's not super favorable for storm development and large-scale lift to help lift and cool this capping inversion. So for parts of Texas, the threat is a lot more conditional today. A lot more conditional. If we can get that outflow boundary to sag into northeast Texas, I think that's going to be the main play as well as perhaps along that weak surface low up there in North Texas if that persists throughout the day. Excuse me. So, again, places like Dallas, Fort Worth, Waco, even as far south as San Antonio, given the absence of strong, large-scale forcing, the threat for severe storms today is going to kind of be very conditional. But if storms do fire, these steep lapse rates aloft will definitely warrant a large to significant hail threat. Very steep lapse rates aloft there. There's already quite a bit of instability, so will be a strongly unstable environment with steep lapse rates aloft. That does mean a large hail threat if storms can fire. That's a big if today. Now, if we go toward the northeast, toward Little Rock, you'll notice much different profile here. We have a much more moist profile. We've been talking about over the last couple days about how we may suffer from a little bit of dry air aloft, quite a bit of dry air aloft actually, in some of these forecast soundings. Well, it appears that the atmosphere has definitely moistened quite a bit. I'm not sure what's going on in here. It's quite saturated here. I'm not sure if that is 100% accurate. There may be something going on with the balloon there as it went up. But the atmosphere is quite moist here in Little Rock, as opposed to down south where we have quite a bit more of that drier air, warm air aloft. So up here in Arkansas, especially near that boundary, which provides quite a bit of small-scale forcing to get storms to go, I do think the much more kind of almost guaranteed sort of target is going to be the Arkansas target today up in the enhanced risk area, just because we have much less cap right now at this morning sounding, and will continue to erode with heating throughout the day. And we have that outflow boundary to help lift the storms, initiate convection along it. So we already have a decent wind profile in place, large looping photographs at both places, so warm convection is ongoing at both of these places. But again, the threat for the southern portion of the outlook into north central Texas is a lot more conditional today. Would not be surprised to see the radar completely clear. But if we can, again, get that outflow boundary into far northeast Texas, perhaps influence from that surface low, that weak surface low up in North Texas, that may be just enough to initiate storms in North Texas for places like Dallas, Fort Worth, up toward Paris, Mount Pleasant, Sulphur Springs, and perhaps even as far south as the Waco area. Maybe a very outside chance down near San Antonio where temperatures might actually be a little bit warmer and we may actually breach the cap due to the warm surface temperatures. But again, we're going to have to just watch and see. Low-level jet here, we'll take a look at that. We've got kind of this southwesterly low-level jet here across the region here, 40-plus knots here. And the orientation of it is a little worrisome as far as from a storm chasing perspective, because what is down here in northwest Mexico, the source region of this air? Well, it's warm, dry air. So if that continues to get pumped in the low to mid levels of the atmosphere, that's going to maintain that elevated mixed layer throughout the day. So that cap may be very difficult to overcome. So for Texas today, a very conditional threat for storms. Again, going to have to watch the trends, the surface map, where that outflow boundary sets up. And if it does set up somewhere here in northeast Texas, that's going to be the main influence. But again, that's very questionable at this point. All right, let's take a look at the, we're going to take a look at the 9Z wrap. The NAM isn't quite in yet, so we're going to look at the wrap model, just kind of show you what the progression of things is going to be for today. So you can kind of see what's going to go on. We kind of get this flattening out of the flow here at 500 millibars. We kind of start out like this with kind of this very, very low amplitude sort of long wave trough across the continental U.S., and then it really flattens out to be this kind of purely zonal flow across the region. Here's our trough for tomorrow and Wednesday. Not going to feel the influence of that today. So, again, large-scale forcing for ascent across the entire region is going to be very negligible. And so we're going to have to rely, again, on those surface boundaries to help us overcome that and initiate convection. Let's go to our low-level jet here throughout the day. And you can see it kind of... whoops, let me go back here. So start it right now for Monday. This is the... So you can see a general decrease in the low-level jet throughout the afternoon here across the region, especially with southern extent into Texas. So that may mean that the wind shear actually up here in north central and northeast Texas is going to be a lot weaker than it is to the northeast east up into Arkansas as that low-level jet moves off toward the northeast. So perhaps down here the main threat, if storms can fire, is going to be large hail. Just given the steep lapse rates aloft, perhaps weaker low-level wind shear for maybe an outside chance at a tornado or two, but mostly large hail threat if storms can fire here in north central Texas. Low-level jet kind of does linger here up into Arkansas, especially with what eastward extent into Tennessee and Kentucky. 30 to 35 plus knot low-level jet there across that region, but it does kind of build back in as we go toward sunset, and the hours after sunset here does actually kind of seep back into northeast and east Texas. So if a storm or two is ongoing here, could tap into that stronger wind shear there and produce maybe a chance of a tornado or two with southern extent. So let's look at our surface map now. You can see where that weak surface low is here up in northwest Texas, right in there. You can see that kind of cyclonic flow around it. And you can see the kind of cold front up here into Kansas and Oklahoma. And again, that outflow boundary, you can't see it on this map, but it's going to be somewhere in there as we go through the day to day. Again, that's going to be something we're really going to have to watch closely. But so as we go on through the afternoon hours, that low kind of maintains itself up by the Red River, up toward the Dallas-Fort Worth area. So given the convergence here at the surface, winds out of the west behind that low, out of the south to the south of that low, that may be just enough convergence to overcome that lingering capping inversion up here in north central Texas to allow storms to fire. And let me actually zoom in here so you can better see it. Let me go to our southern plains sector. So you can see where that surface low is, somewhere up in there, just near the Dallas-Fort Worth metro area up toward the Red River. So the convergence here along that surface low may be enough to get a storm or two to fire up here in north central Texas, perhaps from far southern Oklahoma, places like Ardmore, Durant, down toward the Dallas-Fort Worth metro area. So Dallas-Fort Worth, Denton, Gainesville, you may be at most risk, at least as far as Texas goes, for storms. And again, if that outflow boundary does sag into far northeast Texas, that will be a focus for storms as well. So a couple of different possible forcing mechanisms, but that cap, again, is really, really strong. And you're going to need something with decent convergence to provide decent convergence at the surface, decent, small-scale lift to help overcome this very stout capping inversion in place today across Texas. So we'll wrap things up today. Actually, let me take a look at moisture here and kind of show you. So we do have a very tight dry line again. So there is some decent convergence along this dry line. Winds again out of the west or southwest here to the west of the dry line, out of the south to the south and southeast of that dry line. So there may be enough convergence along the dry line itself as well, perhaps including areas like Waco, down even toward Austin and San Antonio for a storm or two to fire. But the coverage will be very, very isolated today for Texas if storms do fire. Up here into Arkansas, there's our kind of stalled front there, outflow boundary, perhaps somewhere in this vicinity. So let's take a couple soundings here. We'll take one at Little Rock, and then how about one at Fort Smith there? This is at 0Z, so 7 p.m. tonight. Then we'll take one up here just ahead of the dry line there, just on the east side of Dallas. So you can see here the wrap model does stick a little bit of a cap around there. Deep moist layer, though, as we saw with our morning soundings. Not much of a cap it left in place, and I'd be interested to see what this model shows as far as this morning goes. So we'll go to 12Z, 7 a.m. and see. So we looked at our Little Rock sounding, and we'll kind of compare it to what we are seeing up here. So not much capping inversion left here at Little Rock. And so this was this morning. So you can see here on the wrap model initiated a much, much stronger cap here in Little Rock, and we're not really seeing that on the observed morning sounding. So that is something to keep in mind today, that these models may be overdoing the cap a little bit for this evening. You can see that the photographs are quite small in nature, but decent looping clockwise curvature there in the low levels would be adequate for a tornado threat. And given the lack of large-scale forcing, I do think the mode is going to be a lot more discrete, more isolated supercells here along that outflow boundary in Arkansas. You can see down south quite a bit more instability modeled by the wrap here down into Texas. Actually not much of a cap remaining here on the wrap model. So that is interesting. The wrap does erode the cap quite a bit. I would also be interested to see what it was showing this morning at Dallas-Fort Worth, because you saw on our observed sounding quite a bit of capping inversion there remaining at Dallas-Fort Worth. So let's see what the wrap was showing. Yeah, quite the same, maybe a little bit less. Mixed layer sin of about minus 200 there. And so, yeah, so the Dallas-Fort Worth sounding this morning came in with quite a bit more sin, more convective inhibition than what the wrap was showing. So kind of the opposite here for the Texas target, maybe overdoing the erosion of the cap a little bit too much here into Texas. But again, if this does come to fruition, that is quite close to convective initiation. So going to have to watch that for places like Dallas-Fort Worth, up toward Denton, Gainesville, up toward the Red River, including places out to the east as well, Paris, Mount Pleasant, Sulphur Springs, places like that. So that's kind of what we've got going on for today. Let's kind of take a look at what we're seeing here with the convective allowing models, just to kind of give you a couple guesses at what the radar might be later on. So this is the HRRR model, hot off the press. You can see those storms kind of continue throughout the day up into Arkansas, and then along that outflow boundary by 6 p.m. Central Daylight Time, we get numerous discrete supercell thunderstorms to fire out here all the way back into southeast Oklahoma there. So places like Little Rock under the gun today for severe weather. Back down to the southwest, places like Mena, Arkansas, out there in the Ouachita National Forest there. And the herd does have a hint of convection trying to form up here near the Dallas-Fort Worth area and places just north and northeast. So you can tell exactly where that outflow boundary is along the herd here. The outflow boundary is somewhere along there where those discrete supercells fire, so it does lift into southeast Oklahoma and central Arkansas. And we're left kind of at the mercy of that weak surface low and surface convergence there along the dry line to fire storms into Texas. So the herd does try to fire convection. How long it will sustain itself is definitely in question, given perhaps lingering capping in place. But you can see these supercells rage on through eastern Arkansas into southeast Oklahoma and south central Arkansas throughout the evening hours. Maximum tornado threat, I think, would be just at sunset or just after, as that low-level jet starts to ramp up again. So any discrete storm here into south central Arkansas, southwest Arkansas as well, into the Mississippi River Delta there, would have a tornado threat, as well as a large hail and damaging wind threat, before storms kind of congeal throughout the evening, this evening. Take a look at a couple more cams here just for good measure. We'll look at the WRF ARW here. Not quite out. So this is the 0Z run from last night. Kind of gives you the same picture. You can see kind of that outflow out ahead of the storms this morning into Arkansas. And you can see kind of much of the same. Some supercells do fire along that outflow boundary into Arkansas. Keeps Texas dry. So again, we're kind of right on the edge of whether or not we're going to see storms in Texas. If I had to guess right now, I think it's going to be a very widespread threat and that storms will struggle into Texas. This is the NSSL WRF. The NSSL WRF actually does fire supercells down into Texas, just kind of northeast of the Dallas-Fort Worth area and then down south along the I-35 corridor there toward Waco. So this model does fire storms here, the NSSL WRF, whereas Arkansas kind of keeps Arkansas at bay a little bit, surprisingly. So very interesting to note. So interesting to note what the models are showing today. Again, level 3 out of 5 enhanced risk there for north central to west central Arkansas into far southeast Oklahoma. So places like Little Rock, Conway, Maumelle, Lake Dardanelle, up toward north central Arkansas, including places like Fort Smith, the I-40 corridor, and then down southwest into far southeast Oklahoma. And then again, that separate area along the dry line there, Denton, Gainesville, Dallas, Fort Worth, Terrell, places like Paris, Texas, Sulphur Springs, Mount Pleasant, and then down along the I-35 corridor toward Waco, and maybe even as far south as Austin. But again, this kind of target here in Texas along the dry line is much more conditional. If a storm or two can fire, I think large hail is going to be the main threat. Maybe an outside chance for a tornado or two, but I think less low-level wind shear in this area keeps the threat mainly with a large hail threat there. Greater tornado threat going to be along that outflow boundary into central and north central Arkansas into southeast Oklahoma. Going to have to watch the surface map again closely today to see what's going to happen with that outflow boundary. Wherever it stalls, that's going to be where storms are going to fire into central Arkansas vicinity. So with a large hail and damaging wind and tornado threat with those storms as well. So that's all we have for now. Thanks for watching, and we will see you in the next video.